Our controller is the most important tool in our quiver. This is how we operate the board, and this is how we also figure out what our battery is doing and if we can make it back in time. And let's give a shout out to Flite for putting so much data into your controller. Not only can you adjust your ride, but you can manage your battery to a T. Now let's dive into managing your controller. But before we go any further, we need to make sure that our controller is updated. And not only is the controller updated, but your board is updated and the software updates are matching. If you're running on different softwares, you could have some issues and complications out on the water. Now, right after we update our controller, we want to make sure that we calibrate the triggers. So to do so, we're going to hold down the mode button and the negative for about 5 seconds, and you're going to notice that the trigger calibration screen is going to appear. All you have to do is follow the instructions. So you're going to hold down the trigger, wait a few seconds, it's going to tell you to release the trigger, and once you release the trigger, your controller is now calibrated. Now, once everything is calibrated, we want to make sure that our trigger is working properly. So what you can do is just kind of compress the trigger, listen for any grit or any sand that might be in there. If there is anything in there, we can open up the controller using some Allen keys. We'll open it up, clean it out, and then I always recommend greasing it up with some white lithium grease. You can just cake it on the spring, and that'll protect your trigger for a long period of time. Let's start off by looking at our first page, which is distance. It shows our traveled distance and our remaining distance on battery. This is great when you're cruising long distance. You can actually see how far you've gone, how much distance you have remaining, and you can kind of calculate how you're managing that battery based on your distance. Then we have our time page. Our time page shows our elapsed time and remaining time on the battery. Next, we have our speed. We're going to show our max speed and average speed. And then there's a very important page called the battery percentage. This shows your controller battery and your board battery. It's very important that you leave no less than 50%. This is just a rule of thumb. If you go out with less than 50%, you are risking the chance of your controller dying and getting stranded out to sea, so don't do that. And then our EFF screen. This is personally my favorite screen. It's called your efficiency screen. And what it is, it's your watts per distance. So you can put it in watts per mile or watts per kilometer. Basically, the lower this number, the further you can go. So if you're in the kilometer setting, you're gonna try to keep it between 60 and 50. That's gonna extend your ride the most. If you're setting miles, then you're gonna wanna be in around that high 60 to 80 range to extend your miles. Then we have our diagnostic screen. This diagnostic screen has a lot of important information, doesn't really pertain to the average user, but it's got your kilowatts, your RPMs, your battery temperature, and your ESC temp on there. All right, then Flite has added some new modes. So if you hold down the mode button for a few seconds, you're gonna hear a beep, and it's gonna take you right to your drive type. And basically we have our prop and our jet system. So in prop mode, we're gonna always keep that when we have a prop screwed onto the board. If you're gonna put the jet on the board, we have different modes for that. So we have jet and jet boost. Jet boost gives the rider more power off the start. It's gonna give you more RPM. So for you bigger guys or anybody that wants to push the jet, I highly recommend riding jet boost. But for most riders, jet is gonna work just fine. Then if you hit your mode button, you're gonna go into the next screen, and that's gonna show your power level. So we have normal and light rider mode. Normal, it's gonna be what we all use, but light rider mode actually softens up the throttle a little bit. So if you're under that 150 pounds, closer to 100 pounds, you're really gonna like this setting because it's gonna really soften up the throttle on the takeoff. And then when you're riding, you're not gonna get so much lift and dip when you accelerate and decelerate. Next, we have our speed control. So we can actually set a speed limit. So if you're a new rider and you don't wanna go over 20 miles an hour, or you're giving your board to someone who doesn't really know what they're doing, you can actually restrict their speed and keep them safe just by going over to the speed limit mode and hitting the plus or minus button to set that speed. Once your settings are set, hold down the mode button and it's gonna lock in those settings. Now, every time I ride, I do my pre-ride checklist. This is one of them. I like to make sure that all of my settings are the way that I like them, so I don't get any confusion or surprises when I'm out on the water. So make sure you check every time you go. It should save every time, but it's always good to double check. Now, when you're riding your board, your flight controller will actually let you know when you hit 50%. It's gonna vibrate and beep, and it's gonna flash that you're at 50% battery. And then when you hit 40, 30, 20, it'll also do the same thing. Now note, once you're under 50%, you don't really get your 50% back. With batteries, the lower the battery capacity, the more output it needs to provide the same amount of power output. So think about 60% being your true 50. Once you're under 50, you don't want to go below 20. It does damage to your cell and also puts you in risk of going into limp mode, which basically the board can only go as fast. It only goes fast enough to ride on your belly, and it's very limited. So don't rely on limp mode. Try to avoid going under 20. As soon as you hit 20%, head back in. You don't really get your 20% back. It goes 20, 15, 10, 0. It can go that way, and you don't want to take that chance. So avoid going below 20, ride smart, get home safely.